Chapter 1. First Day in Galactic University. Professor Alan Hart straightened his tie as he stepped into the bustling corridors of Galactic University. Today was not just another day. It was his first day teaching at one of the most prestigious institutions spanning across the star systems. The air buzzed with the chatter of species from numerous planets, their various languages creating a symphony of galactic discourse. Alan entered his classroom, his nerves slightly on edge but excited about the prospects. He arranged his notes on the podium and scanned the room filled with eager young faces and a few older ones, of different colors, shapes, and sizes. Humans were a minority here, and they seemed just as curious about him as he was about them. "Good morning, class," Alan began, his voice echoing slightly in the amphitheater-style room. "I am Professor Hart, and I'll be leading your course on intergalactic relations this semester. I hope to learn as much from you as you do from me." A murmur of acknowledgement swept through the students. Alan noticed a young human woman sitting in the back, her eyes on a datapad instead of paying attention to his introduction. He decided to make engagement his first task. "As a start, I'd like us to go around and introduce ourselves. Name, planet, and one interesting fact about your culture, please," Alan instructed. The students shared their stories, offering glimpses into their rich cultural heritages. However, the human woman remained silent, absorbed in her device. Alan walked over, leaning slightly to catch her eye. "Miss, would you mind sharing with the class?" he asked, a gentle prompt. The woman looked up, her expression one of mild embarrassment mixed with defiance. "Sorry, Professor, I'm Sarah. From Earth. Interesting fact. We humans are known for our emotional expressions, I guess." Her answer was brief, and Alan sensed there was more to her than met the eye. He nodded, giving her a small smile to show there were no hard feelings before moving on. After the introductions, Alan dove into his lecture about the importance of diplomacy in galactic relations. He used a holographic map to point out various interstellar trade routes, conflict zones, and alliances. The students were engaged, asking questions and debating points Alan raised. As the class ended, Alan announced, "Your assignment for next week is a reflective essay on the potential impacts of cultural misunderstandings in interstellar negotiations. Use examples from today's discussion." The students began to pack up. Alan noticed Sarah again, her brow furrowed as she typed rapidly on her datapad. This time, he approached her with a more academic inquiry. "Sarah, may I ask what you were working on during class?" "You seemed quite absorbed," Alan said, peering curiously at the array of alien script on her screen. Sarah hesitated, then responded, "I was taking notes, Professor, in different galactic languages. It helps me understand better." "Really?" Alan was genuinely intrigued. "That's an impressive skill. How many languages are you fluent in?" "5," she replied, her guard beginning to drop. "But I'm still learning the nuances of galactic dialects." Alan smiled, appreciating the complexity of her task. "That's quite commendable, Sarah. Perhaps you could help me with some translations sometime. I could use an expert in my research." Sarah looked surprised but pleased. "I'd like that, Professor," she said, her initial reserve fading into a look of anticipation. As the students filed out, Alan felt a surge of satisfaction. Teaching here wouldn't just be a challenge, it would be an adventure. He was ready to learn not just from the curriculum, but from his students like Sarah, who brought with them their own worlds of knowledge. Chapter 2. A Clash of Perspectives. The next week, Professor Alan Hart arrived early to prepare for his lecture. As students trickled into the classroom, the murmur of anticipation filled the air. Alan organized his notes and checked the holographic projector, ensuring everything was set for today's discussion on cultural misunderstandings in galactic diplomacy. Before the class could settle, Alan decided to address last week's assignment. I hope everyone has submitted their essays on the portal. Today, I'd like us to discuss some of your thoughts in person. Who would like to start? A tall Martokian from the back raised his hand, his 4 eyes blinking asynchronously. Professor, I wrote about the trade agreement of Alfarian. The misunderstanding there nearly led to a trade war due to translation errors. Excellent example, Alan nodded. Language barriers can indeed create significant challenges. Anyone else? As various students shared their insights, Alan noticed Sarah, her eyes once again locked on her datapad. He made a mental note to speak with her again after class. The bell rang, signaling the end of the session. The students began to gather their belongings. Alan approached Sarah, who seemed ready to bolt out the door. "Sarah, a moment please," Alan called out. She stopped, turning to face him with a guarded look. "I noticed you've been quite distant during our discussions. Is everything all right with your assignments?" Alan asked, his tone soft but firm. Sarah sighed, a mix of frustration and embarrassment crossing her face. "Professor Hart, I've been keeping up with the work, but I feel like you don't really see how much effort I'm putting in. Just because I'm not speaking up as much." Alan raised an eyebrow. "It's not about how loud you are in class, Sarah. It's about engagement. Can you tell me what you thought of the assignment?" Sarah opened her datapad, showing him her essay. "I wrote about the Cygnus incident, where cultural rituals were misunderstood as political aggression. I used different galactic languages to support my points." Alan read the first few lines, impressed by her analysis, but also noticing the complexity due to the language use. "Sarah, this is quite detailed, but I'm concerned that the multilingual approach might be obscuring your arguments for those not familiar with these languages. But isn't this about understanding cultural nuances?" "That's what I'm trying to convey," Sarah argued, her voice firm. "You have a valid point, but remember, your audience here may not share your multilingual abilities. You need to make your analysis accessible," Alan explained. Sarah frowned, considering his words. "Maybe I can include a glossary of terms or a brief explanation within the text." "That would be excellent," Alan smiled, pleased with her responsiveness. "And Sarah, I truly appreciate the depth of your work. It shows a level of dedication that's rare." Sarah's expression softened. "Thank you, Professor. I'll work on that for next time." As Sarah left, another student, Tom, a human classmate, approached Alan. "Professor, I've noticed Sarah's skills too. Maybe we could work together on a presentation? I think her language skills could really complement the historical examples I want to discuss." Alan considered Tom's suggestion. "That sounds like a productive collaboration. Why don't you pitch the idea to her?" "I will," Tom said, nodding. "Thanks, Professor." Alan watched as Tom hurried after Sarah, hopeful that this could be the beginning of a fruitful partnership. As the classroom emptied, Alan felt a renewed sense of purpose. His role wasn't just to teach, but to foster connections that could bridge galaxies. Chapter 3: Unveiling the Secret. Professor Alan Hart had always believed that a good teacher learns as much from their students as the students do from them. As he prepared for today's office hours, he thought about how best to encourage Sarah and Tom in their collaborative effort. The idea of them working together pleased him. It could lead to a groundbreaking project that underscored the importance of cultural and linguistic diversity. Alan was arranging his desk when Tom and Sarah arrived together. Their faces bore mixed expressions of excitement and apprehension. "Professor Hart, we've come up with a proposal for that presentation," Tom started, his tone eager. "Let's hear it," Alan said, gesturing for them to sit. Sarah took out her datapad and began. We want to analyze historical conflicts resolved through cultural and linguistic understanding. We'll include case studies and translate key documents to show how language barriers were overcome. Alan nodded, impressed. That sounds comprehensive. How can I assist you in this? We need access to the university's Galactic archives for some rare documents, and maybe some guidance on structuring our analysis, Tom added. Of course, I can arrange that, Alan replied, and I'd like to see your initial drafts once they're ready. As they discussed the project, another student, Marcus, a human linguistics major, knocked and entered Alan's office. Professor, I heard about the project from Tom and wonder if I could contribute. My focus on syntax might help clarify some of the translations. Alan saw the potential for a more robust analysis with Marcus's inclusion. That sounds like a valuable addition. What do you think, Sarah, Tom? Both nodded in agreement, and the group began to brainstorm. The discussion was lively, with each student bringing unique insights. Alan facilitated, ensuring each idea was heard and integrated. As the meeting drew to a close, Alan reflected on the energy in the room. This collaboration could lead to something significant. You're not just completing an assignment. You're potentially creating something that could be part of your academic legacy. Sarah, usually reserved, smiled broadly. Thank you, Professor Hart. I didn't expect to find such support here. Tom clapped his hands together. Let's get to work then. First, we hit the archives. As the students left, buzzing with plans, Alan felt a deep satisfaction. This was why he had chosen teaching. Watching his students come together, share their skills, and build something that could one day contribute to greater understanding across galaxies was profoundly fulfilling. He made a mental note to check on their progress regularly and offer support whenever needed. Chapter 4. A Change of Approach. The archives of Galactic University were a labyrinthine wonder. Endless chambers stretched with walls of illuminated data panels, ancient holograms, and interactive recordings from hundreds of species. It was the intellectual heart of the campus, and today it played host to an unlikely team of humans led, somewhat unofficially, by Professor Alan Hart. "All right, team," Alan said, setting his satchel down on one of the glossy, crystalline tables. "Our goal is clear. We're looking for original documents from cases where diplomacy succeeded through language and cultural understanding. Let's divide and conquer." Tom leaned back in his chair with a grin. "Divide and conquer? Now you're talking like a general, Professor." Alan chuckled. "Only if I get to be the one handing out coffee rations." He turned to Sarah and Marcus. "Sarah, you're our language expert. I'd like you to focus on anything untranslated. Marcus, your expertise on syntax will help contextualize what Sarah finds. Tom, I need you to comb through case summaries and extract critical events for the timeline." The group nodded, each one looking more motivated than the last. Alan felt a surge of pride watching them settle into their work. He rolled up his sleeves and joined in, determined to contribute. Hours passed. The air in the archives was silent except for the soft hum of data terminals and the occasional whisper of discovery. Alan leaned over Sarah's shoulder as she worked on translating an old treaty from the Lorvan incidents, a pivotal moment in interstellar history. "Look here," Sarah muttered, pointing at the holographic text she'd expanded. The Lorvan negotiators used metaphors that only made sense when translated through their cultural lens. It explains why the humans at the time thought the treaty implied war. "That's fascinating," Alan said, his brow furrowing. "So, the Lorvans described peace through hunting metaphors?" "Exactly." Sarah turned, excitement lighting up her face. "They called it The Hunt Without Prey, which translates literally as mutual respect. The humans didn't realize that because they were too focused on the imagery. Alan gave her a firm nod. Add this as a key example in the presentation. It highlights how context is often more important than direct meaning. Across the table, Marcus's voice interrupted. "Professor! Sarah! Check this out!" He flicked a holographic display toward them. "I've cross-referenced the Lorvan case with 2 other treaties, one from the Zelvins and another from the Kaltari. They all use indirect metaphors as the language of peace. Different symbols, but the same pattern." "Good work, Marcus," Alan said, walking over. "Compile those parallels. They'll reinforce the argument that understanding the linguistic nuances of another species isn't just academic. It's practical." Tom, who had been flipping between event summaries, let out a groan. Why is history always so complicated? It's like every success story starts with a misunderstanding. "Which is exactly the point," Alan replied, smirking. "If language was simple, diplomacy wouldn't need interpreters, or people like Sarah, for that matter." Sarah shot him a playful glare. "Careful, Professor. I might start charging you for compliments." The group laughed, the earlier tension from their workload breaking apart. Alan glanced at the clock. Nearly evening. He clapped his hands together, drawing everyone's attention. "All right, team. We've made some solid progress today. Let's wrap it up here and grab something to eat." "You've earned it." Tom jumped to his feet, stretching. "If this place has a food court, I vote we raid it." Marcus grinned. "Let's hope they serve something other than Martokian root paste." The small, bustling cafeteria was nestled on the edge of the archives. Its windows overlooked the campus courtyard, where students from a dozen species mingled under the twilight of the twin moons. Alan and his team grabbed trays of food, surprisingly varied, and claimed a corner table. "Did you know the Zelvins eat everything cold?" Tom asked, poking at his dish. "Even soup." Sarah smirked as she peeled open a wrap. "It's because their species evolved in sub-zero temperatures. Their enzymes break down food faster when it's frozen." Tom stared at her. "You know, Sarah, you could teach half the classes here." "I'll stick to being a student for now," Sarah shot back, though there was a flicker of pride in her tone. Alan watched the exchange, smiling. It was refreshing to see such camaraderie among them. He decided to stoke the momentum. "You know, you're onto something with this project. You're not just presenting history. You're showing how understanding one another's languages is the key to avoiding unnecessary conflict." Marcus nodded. "If we finish this properly, it could be more than just a presentation. The university might even archive it as reference material." "You're getting ahead of yourself, Marcus," Sarah said with a shake of her head. "Let's just get through this first." "I think Marcus has a point," Alan interjected. "The work you're doing, translating these documents, connecting the dots, has real value. Don't underestimate what you're creating here." The table fell quiet for a moment as everyone considered his words. Then Tom, unable to resist, broke the silence. "Fine, we'll become legends. But legends need dessert." Alan laughed. "You're relentless, Tom. Go get us something sweet." As the evening wore on, Alan found himself leaning back in his chair, watching his students talk and laugh. The day had been long, but productive. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this invested, this proud to be a part of something. When the team finally decided to call it a night, Sarah lingered for a moment as the others filed out. "Professor." Alan turned to her. "What's on your mind, Sarah?" She hesitated. "Thank you. I know I can come off as difficult sometimes, but this project means a lot to me." Alan shook his head gently. "You're not difficult, Sarah. You're passionate. Don't lose that. It's what makes you stand out." She smiled, genuine and soft, and nodded before heading off to join the others. As Alan walked back to his office under the glow of the moons, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't just teaching. He was learning from students who would one day help humanity find its place among the stars. Chapter 5. Deepening Connections. The weeks passed in a blur of activity for Professor Alan Hart and his team. The project was rapidly taking shape, and each session in the Galactic University archives brought new discoveries and deeper insights. Alan found himself more engaged than he'd been in years, not just as a professor, but as part of something bigger, a true collaboration. It was late afternoon when Alan called the group together for a progress check. They met in one of the quiet study halls, the room dominated by a glowing holotable projecting layers of data, treaties, and maps they'd uncovered. "All right, team," Alan said, setting his mug down. "Let's see where we are. Tom, you first. How's the event timeline coming along?" Tom, as always, wore his trademark grin. "Almost done, Professor. I've mapped the Lorvan, Kaltari, and Zelvin case studies to show how their conflicts escalated and then resolved through cultural understanding. It all ties back to language gaps. Good work." Alan turned to Marcus, who was sifting through a datapad. Marcus adjusted his glasses, looking up with an air of quiet satisfaction. "The syntax comparisons are solid. I've linked similar linguistic patterns across the treaties. For instance, the Lorvan's hunt without prey parallels the Zelvin's dance of frozen stillness. Both describe peace, but rely on metaphors tied to their cultural survival." "Excellent," Alan replied, impressed as always by Marcus's precision. He looked at Sarah last. She was seated on the edge of the table, datapad in hand, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "Sarah, how are the translations coming?" Sarah looked up, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I finished the Lorvan Treaty and the Zelvin conflict records. I'm working on the Kaltari scripts now. They're more complex because their language uses emotional context embedded in word tone." Tom leaned back in his chair. "So they're like emotional singers?" Sarah smirked. "Close enough. It's like combining music and speech. A slight tonal shift can change the entire meaning of a sentence." Alan couldn't hide his admiration. "You've done an extraordinary job, Sarah. These translations are what tie the whole project together." She shrugged, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "I'm just doing what I know." "Don't downplay it," Marcus chimed in. "Your work is what's making these ancient texts come alive." "Agreed," Alan said firmly. "Now that the pieces are falling into place, we need to think about the presentation itself. How are we structuring this? I want you all involved in delivering it." Tom shot his hand up with exaggerated enthusiasm. "I call the introduction. I can set the stage, hook the audience, make them laugh or something." Alan grinned. "Fine. You're our showman. Marcus, I'll handle the data and linguistic patterns. You know, graphs, visuals, the boring stuff." "Not boring," Alan corrected. "Essential. And Sarah, you?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'll explain the translations and cultural contexts. I want people to understand how these misunderstandings happened and how language shaped the outcomes." "That's perfect," Alan said. "You'll make them see what you've uncovered, how subtle differences in language can bridge or break relationships." Tom leaned in with mock concern. "What about you, Professor? Are you just going to stand there looking proud?" Alan chuckled. I'll provide the closing summary. Tie it all together. And yes, Tom, I'll try to look proud while doing it. As the evening wore on, the group fine-tuned their presentation. Diagrams were adjusted, speeches practiced, and debates erupted over which examples were most compelling. It was productive chaos, and Alan loved every minute of it. When the clock neared 9 p.m., Alan stood up, stretching his back. "All right, team. I think we've done enough for tonight. Let's meet again tomorrow to polish this up." Tom pushed his chair back with a groan. "Finally. I'm starving. Anyone else?" "I could eat," Marcus admitted, rubbing his neck. Alan turned to Sarah, who was still focused on her datapad. "Sarah, are you coming?" She looked up, as though pulled from another world. "Oh, sure." The group made their way to the campus dining hall, which was nearly deserted at this hour. They grabbed trays and sat at their usual table by the window. Outside, the twin moons bathed the courtyard in silvery light, casting strange shadows over the alien architecture. "So, Professor," Tom began between bites of something that resembled spaghetti but tasted faintly of citrus, "why did you come to teach at Galactic University? Seems like an odd place for a human professor." Alan sipped his tea thoughtfully before answering. "Because there's no better place to learn. Back on Earth, we think we know so much, but out here, among all these cultures, I realized how little we truly understand. I wanted to be part of that learning process." Sarah looked at him curiously. "Do you ever feel out of place here?" Alan met her gaze, his expression softening. "Sometimes. But then I remind myself that learning happens at the edge of our comfort zones. Feeling out of place is just a sign that you're growing." The table fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over them. Then Tom, ever the mood-breaker, smirked. "Professor Hart, you're starting to sound like a motivational speaker." Alan laughed. "If I start selling inspirational holos, you'll be the first to know." As they finished eating, the group lingered longer than necessary. It felt comfortable, easy. Alan realized that the project had done more than bring them together academically. It had made them a team. He watched as Tom teased Marcus over his meticulous note-taking, and Sarah shared a quiet smile with Marcus over some inside joke. Alan finally stood, gathering his tray. "All right, everyone. Get some rest. Tomorrow we make this presentation shine." Tom saluted dramatically. "Yes, sir." As they left the dining hall and walked across the moonlit courtyard, Sarah fell into step beside Alan. "Professor, I'm glad you pushed me to do this project," she said quietly. "I didn't think I'd fit here at first. But now it feels different." Alan glanced at her, seeing the sincerity in her expression. "You fit here because you brought something no one else could, Sarah. Don't forget that." She nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. As the team split off in different directions, Alan headed back to his office, his mind buzzing with thoughts of the work still ahead. This project wasn't just another academic exercise. It was something real, something meaningful, and he couldn't wait to see it all come together. Chapter 6. Cultural Revelations. The presentation day arrived sooner than anyone expected. The auditorium buzzed with a quiet hum of anticipation as students, professors, and visiting scholars settled into their seats. Galactic University didn't take academic showcases lightly. Interstellar research was revered here, and a well-executed presentation could open doors for students and faculty alike. Professor Alan Hart stood with Sarah, Tom, and Marcus just outside the stage entrance. The faint echo of voices inside drifted into the hallway, but it was the nervous energy of his team that demanded his attention. Tom fidgeted with his notes, Marcus rechecked his holographic visuals for the 100th time, and Sarah, though outwardly composed, stared at her datapad as if it held the secret to existence. Alan clapped his hands softly to gather their focus. "All right, team. Deep breaths. We've prepared for this. You've all done an exceptional job, and this is your moment to share it. Remember, no one knows this material better than you." Tom smirked. "Easy for you to say, Professor. You're not going first." Alan raised an eyebrow, his voice light but firm. "You'll be fine, Tom. Just remember, keep it clear, keep it focused, and try not to turn it into stand-up comedy." Marcus let out a dry laugh. "No promises there." Sarah finally looked up from her datapad. "What if they don't get it? I mean, the translations, the metaphors. What if it's too complicated?" Alan shook his head. "It's not. You've worked too hard for that. Trust yourself, Sarah. You'll make them see what you see." He softened his tone, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this." Sarah gave a small nod, and Alan could see the faintest trace of a smile. It was enough. "All right," he said, stepping back. "Let's get out there." Inside the auditorium, the lights dimmed as the holoprojector flared to life, displaying the title of their presentation, Understanding Diplomacy Through Language, Bridging Cultures Across the Stars. Tom took the stage first, his usual confidence tempered by the seriousness of the occasion. He cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying his voice across the vast room. "Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom, and along with my team, we're here to discuss something simple but often overlooked: words. Words shape civilizations. They resolve wars, spark alliances, and, sometimes, cause catastrophic misunderstandings." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Alan watched from the side, nodding approvingly. Tom had their attention. "Take the Lorvan incident," Tom continued, gesturing toward the holoprojector. "Two sides nearly went to war because of metaphors. The hunt without prey. Humans misinterpreted it as a threat. Turns out, for the Lorvans, it was a way of describing peace, mutual respect." The holoprojector shifted to Sarah's translation of the original Lorvan text, glowing in delicate script. Tom stepped back. "And now, I'll turn it over to the person who brought these words to life. Sarah." Sarah took a breath and walked onto the stage. For a moment, Alan felt the tension in the room. She hesitated, datapad in hand, then began speaking, clear, steady, and confident. "When I first read this text, I didn't just translate it. I felt it. The Lorvans speak in metaphors because their culture values hunting as a foundation for survival. To them, a hunt without prey isn't meaningless. It's an agreement, a shared understanding that no harm will be done. But imagine how that sounds to a species unfamiliar with their way of thinking." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "This isn't just about language. It's about context. Understanding a culture's history, values, and way of thinking transforms words that seem threatening into words that build peace." Alan couldn't stop himself from smiling as he watched her. She was captivating, completely in control. The audience was rapt, their focus entirely on her. Sarah transitioned smoothly to Marcus, who presented detailed comparisons between the Lorvan, Zelvin, and Kaltari treaties. His explanations were precise, the holovisuals highlighting patterns in syntax and metaphor. When you look at these cases side by side, you'll notice the similarities. 3 species, 3 different languages, but one consistent idea. Peace isn't always direct. It's often implied, expressed through symbols that only make sense when you understand the culture. Marcus's graphs and charts brought clarity to Sarah's work, weaving everything together seamlessly. The transitions were polished, the teamwork evident. Finally, Alan stepped onto the stage to close. "This project isn't just an academic exercise," Alan began, his voice steady and deliberate. "It's a reminder that understanding begins with listening, not just to words, but to the cultures and histories behind them. Language is not just a tool for communication, it's a reflection of identity. When we dismiss what we don't understand, we miss opportunities to connect, to learn, and to build something greater." He paused, looking out at the audience, now silent and thoughtful. In a universe this vast, we humans have a unique challenge, to find our place among civilizations far older and wiser than ours. But we also bring something invaluable, our willingness to learn, to listen, and, when necessary, to see the world through someone else's words. The room erupted into applause. Backstage, the team regrouped, the rush of their success evident on their faces. Tom fist-bumped Marcus. "Told you we'd nail it." Marcus adjusted his glasses, smiling faintly. "Not bad, I'll admit." Sarah exhaled a shaky breath, her face lighting up with a rare, full smile. "I can't believe they listened." "They didn't just listen," Alan said, joining them. "You made them understand. That's something rare, Sarah. All of you. You should be proud." Tom grinned. "So, Professor, does this mean we get extra credit?" Alan shook his head, laughing. "I think the recognition you just earned is worth more than that." As they left the auditorium, other students and faculty approached to congratulate them, asking questions and praising their work. Sarah was surrounded by a small group, her voice animated as she explained nuances in her translations. Alan hung back, watching with quiet pride. Marcus nudged him lightly. "You know, Professor, you were right. We didn't just learn from this project. We made something." Alan nodded. "You did. And I have a feeling it's only the beginning." For the first time in years, Alan felt the true satisfaction of teaching, not just delivering knowledge, but helping his students create something meaningful, something that could, in its own way, build bridges far beyond the walls of Galactic University. Chapter 7: Galactic Recognition. The days following the presentation were a whirlwind for Professor Alan Hart and his team. The ripples of their work spread faster than any of them had anticipated. Word traveled across the university, and their findings, centered on the importance of language, context, and culture in diplomacy, became the talk of campus. Now, Alan stood outside the main auditorium once again, this time for the Galactic Linguistics Conference, where the team had been invited to present their project to an audience of academics, diplomats, and students from across the known star systems. It was a far bigger stage, one Alan himself had only dreamed of years before. Sarah, Tom, and Marcus gathered beside him, their expressions a mix of excitement and nerves. The glow of the auditorium entrance cast their silhouettes across the polished floor, and Alan could see Sarah quietly reviewing her notes again while Tom adjusted his jacket. "You know," Tom said with a dramatic sigh, breaking the silence, "if I mess up, someone here might declare a war just for fun." Marcus rolled his eyes. "If anyone declares war over your jokes, they're probably justified." Alan chuckled, shaking his head. "You'll be fine, Tom. The audience is here to listen and learn, not critique your stand-up routine." Tom grinned. "You're too kind, Professor. I'll take that as permission to ad-lib." "Don't push it," Alan replied with mock warning before turning to Sarah. She stood apart, the datapad tight in her hands, though her face betrayed none of her nerves. "You've reviewed everything, haven't you?" Alan asked gently. She nodded without looking up. "Twice. Maybe 3 times. You don't need to prove anything more, Sarah. The work speaks for itself. You're ready." Her eyes finally met his, searching for sincerity. Alan offered a confident smile, one that seemed to ease her tension, if only slightly. Tom cleared his throat loudly. "Okay, pep talk done? Good. Because we're up." The auditorium was vast, far larger than anything they'd experienced during the university presentation. Delegates from various species filled the rows, some humanoid, others far less recognizable. Bioluminescent Zelvins sat beside crystalline Galarites, their forms refracting the soft blue glow of the overhead lights. Human diplomats were present, too, Earth's flags visible among the decorative displays. Alan sat near the front as Tom, Sarah, and Marcus took the stage. He wasn't worried. He had seen them grow into their roles, sharpen their delivery, and truly own the work they'd produced together. Tom stepped up first, his voice booming across the hall. "Ladies, gentlemen, and esteemed beings from across the stars, thank you for being here. I'm Tom, and today we'll take you on a journey through history, words, and meanings that shaped diplomacy." He paused, letting the light humor settle as some delegates gave amused chirps, hums, or clicks, expressions of laughter in their respective languages. Tom gestured to the holoprojector. "We'll start with the Lorvan incident, a case where humans and Lorvans almost tore each other apart. Over a metaphor." The glowing text appeared, Sarah's carefully translated phrases juxtaposed with the literal, mistaken interpretations. Tom's confident explanations gave way to Marcus, who elaborated on the patterns in linguistic structures. Marcus pointed to the highlighted words, shifting across the screen. As you can see, cultural context influences how meaning is conveyed. For Lorvans, hunting metaphors represented peace and balance. For humans unfamiliar with their symbols, the words were seen as hostile. The crowd murmured, clearly intrigued. A Zelvan delegate raised a shimmering arm. How did humans overcome this misunderstanding? This was Sarah's cue. She stepped forward, the spotlight on her as she began to explain. The Lorvan diplomats recognized the misunderstanding first. They created a new document using literal phrasing. However, their culture considered this a loss of meaning, stripping away their identity to accommodate outsiders. It was only when the humans learned their metaphorical context that real dialogue began. The holographic images transitioned to show similar examples from Zelvan and Kaltari diplomacy. Sarah's voice grew steadier, more confident with every word. Language is more than words. It's identity. It reflects a species' values, struggles, and way of seeing the world. Without understanding the culture behind it, words become meaningless, or worse, dangerous. A Galarite delegate chimed in, their crystalline form resonating softly. "This is not limited to Lorvans." The Kaltari treaties carried similar misunderstandings until cultural context was considered. Sarah nodded. "Exactly. That's what our work highlights. Diplomacy cannot succeed without understanding the why behind the words." Tom, sensing the perfect moment, took the final transition. "Which brings us here, to today, where our ability to listen and understand, across species, languages, and histories, will determine the future of interstellar relations." The auditorium fell silent for a heartbeat before applause erupted, a multisensory cacophony of clicks, hums, glowing displays, and human claps. Backstage, the team was glowing with triumph. Tom flopped into a chair, pretending to wipe sweat from his forehead. "That's it. I'm retiring. I've peaked." Marcus rolled his eyes. "You'd get bored within a day." Sarah, visibly relieved, turned to Alan as he approached. "We did it." "You did more than that," Alan said, his voice proud. "You held the attention of delegates from half the known galaxy and made them see something they'd missed before. That's no small thing." Sarah smiled faintly. "It wasn't just me. We did this together." Tom raised an imaginary glass. To teamwork, and to not sparking any wars. Alan laughed, shaking his head. You've earned the celebration. I couldn't be prouder of all of you. Before long, university representatives and delegates approached them, offering handshakes, nods, or glimmering gestures of approval. A human diplomat even stopped to tell Alan, "Your students have done something remarkable. I hope this research reaches every corner of the galaxy." Alan turned back to his team, his heart full. In all his years of teaching, he'd never experienced a moment quite like this. His students hadn't just proven themselves, they'd uncovered something that could shape the future. And as Sarah, Tom, and Marcus laughed and debated over who'd flubbed the least, Alan knew this was more than a project. It was a turning point, for them, for him, and maybe for a galaxy still learning to listen. Chapter 8. New Horizons. The days following the Galactic Linguistics Conference felt surreal to Professor Alan Hart and his team. Their presentation had sparked conversations far beyond the walls of the university. Alan had received messages from diplomats, scholars, and even journalists curious about their findings. For Sarah, Tom, and Marcus, the attention was both exciting and overwhelming, but Alan ensured they remained grounded. Today, however, things were calmer. Alan sat in his office, surrounded by datapads, notes, and a fresh cup of coffee that sent gentle steam spiraling toward the ceiling. Just as he settled into reviewing a new request to publish their findings, a familiar voice broke through the quiet. "Professor, are you hiding in here again?" Alan looked up to see Tom leaning against the doorway, his ever-present grin in place. Behind him, Sarah and Marcus appeared, carrying their own datapads. "I'm not hiding," Alan replied, chuckling. "I'm working. There's a difference." "Well, we're interrupting," Tom said, stepping in and plopping himself into the chair across from Alan's desk. Marcus and Sarah followed, taking seats of their own. Alan set down his pen, eyeing the trio. "To what do I owe the honor of this surprise visit?" "We wanted to share something with you," Sarah said, glancing at Marcus, who nodded in agreement. Marcus opened his datapad, projecting a holographic image onto Alan's desk. It was an official university announcement, a call for interstellar research proposals that would fund long-term projects exploring linguistic and cultural misunderstandings across developing star systems. Tom leaned forward, pointing at the text. "We think our project qualifies, Professor." The success of our presentation got the right people's attention, and now they're looking for teams to expand this research into the field. Alan's brow lifted as he scanned the details. This is a significant opportunity. You'd be traveling to other systems, working directly with diplomats and local scholars. It's a huge step. "We know," Sarah said softly, her eyes shining with both excitement and uncertainty. "And we want you to lead it." Alan blinked, surprised. "Me?" "Of course you," Marcus added. "You guided us through all of this. It wouldn't have happened without you." Tom grinned, his usual humor tempered by sincerity. "You're not just a professor, Alan. You're part of this team. It wouldn't feel right doing this without you." For a moment, Alan couldn't speak. He looked at the three of them, students he had seen struggle, grow, and ultimately excel. They were offering him something more than a position. They were asking him to continue the journey they'd started together. "Are you sure about this?" Alan finally asked, his voice calm. "This is your work. You've earned the right to take the lead." Sarah shook her head firmly. "This work belongs to all of us, and we're not ready to say goodbye to our best teacher just yet." Marcus nodded. "You've always said learning happens at the edge of our comfort zones. This is our chance to keep learning, and you should be there with us." Tom leaned back with a grin. "Besides, We need someone to keep us in line. You're our moral compass, Professor. And you're pretty good with the logistics." Alan couldn't help but laugh, shaking his head. "You three really are impossible." He paused, his gaze moving between them. "But you're also right. This work matters. If we can help prevent even one misunderstanding out there, then it's worth the effort." "So you'll do it?" Sarah asked, leaning forward slightly. Alan exhaled slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes. Let's take this as far as we can." The next few weeks became a blur of preparation. Meetings with university administrators, drafting the official proposal, coordinating travel plans, and organizing research goals consumed their days. What had started as a small project in the archives was now evolving into something far greater, an opportunity to create real change in the galaxy. One afternoon, Alan and Sarah stood in the archives where it had all begun. The familiar hum of ancient data streams filled the air as they reviewed notes and organized the final proposal. "I never imagined we'd end up here," Sarah admitted, running a hand over a glowing interface panel. "When you called me out in that first lecture, I thought you were just another professor who didn't care." Alan smiled faintly. "I didn't expect much either, at first. But you proved me wrong. You were never just another student, Sarah. You were always pushing beyond what anyone else could see." She looked at him, her expression soft. "You know, I used to think being a human here meant I had to work twice as hard to be noticed. But now I realize it wasn't about proving myself. It was about showing what we humans can bring to the table." Alan nodded. "And you did that beautifully." She smiled, then tilted her head thoughtfully. "Why did you push so hard for us, Professor? You could have just kept things simple." Alan's voice was steady but reflective. "Because I believe that every culture, every species, has something valuable to offer. Humanity's strength isn't just in surviving. It's in our curiosity, our adaptability, and our drive to connect. You, Tom, and Marcus reminded me of that. You made me believe in it all over again." Sarah studied him for a moment, then smiled warmly. "Thank you for not giving up on us." Alan shook his head, his tone light. "Thank you for reminding me why I love teaching." The final approval for their proposal came 2 days later. The University Council commended the project as a critical step toward interstellar cooperation, and funding was officially secured. Alan gathered with his team in the courtyard under the twin moons to celebrate. Tom raised his glass of fizzy alien punch. "To Professor Hart, our fearless leader and the guy who somehow kept us from falling apart." "To all of us," Alan corrected, lifting his own glass. "This was a team effort, and it'll stay that way." As laughter echoed through the courtyard, Alan looked around at his students, now colleagues. They weren't just completing an academic project anymore. They were stepping into the galaxy as explorers, researchers, and ambassadors of understanding. He turned his gaze upward, where the stars stretched endlessly into the unknown. For the first time in a long time, Alan felt that familiar pull, the quiet call of discovery. "Ready to explore the stars, Professor?" Sarah asked, standing beside him. Alan smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "More than ever, Sarah. More than ever."